wam pani ciosnie mi widzieli, niech was parą wezmę, aj z wasimi drami.
For all of human history, people have looked up upon crackling lightning and roaring thunder, and have told stories about what causes it and what happens when lightning flashes. Some people attribute it a bird whose wings flap like the beating of drums, and lightning is the flashing of their ferocious eyes, the great but terrifying protector of the sky. Or they saw a demon dancing to the beat of many drums, hitting each drumhead with hammers, and his hypnotic thrashing, quicker than the eye can see, is the flashing of lightning. Or they've seen a warrior in the sky, whose hammer crashes to the ground as he swings it around, reflecting light in a blur, like a blacksmith hard at work in his forge. Or they've seen a king, sitting atop the sky, who hurls his harpoon-like bolts, much like a fisherman, his weapons carried by his shield maidens. Every culture has been enamored by the most horrifying and beautiful embodiment of the sky, and when the ancient Slavs looked up at the summer storm through their frame of reference, they saw horses tearing across the steppe of the sky, and the hunter-warrior of their tribes who rode atop them, striking all around himself in the fervor of the hunt, chasing and striking down the demons of destruction in wintertime, the hoof-falls of hunter and prey blending into distant rolling thunder, and kicking up black clouds. So the Slavs saw this rider in the sky, faster than can ever be seen, hurling his arrows or spears or axes made of fire, and they called him the quick-striking one, Per, into Perun, and its myriad of forms, and also into the common word for lightning in several living and archaic Slavic languages and dialects. For example, in the mainstream dialect of Polish, when you see lightning, the beam of the electricity itself, which is called the bolt in English, is named Pierun, while the halo of white light which cascades off of him and across the clouds is named błyskawica, which is derived from flashing. The sound you hear in the distance as thunder is named jmat, while sometimes the singular claps of thunder accompanying specific bolts of lightning can be named Grom, though Grom can also be plural. The figure of Perun has left his mark across Slavic culture in a myriad of forms, from the ancient ritual to syncretic folklore with saints to the thunderers of the modern world. This is Slavic Polytheism 101, and today we discuss Perun, piece by piece and domain by domain, in hopes of making this colossal figure as easy as possible to understand. Elder Oaks. We'd like to begin with exploring the sacred symbols of Perun and how they tie into folk culture, but as you'll soon find, they all interlap and intertangle in culture. So we'll try our best to keep this organized, but if the discussion shifts suddenly, that's due to the nature of symbolism entangling on itself. In the botanical gardens of Krakow, a visitor can still meet a nearly 250-year-old oak tree, planted between the first and second partitions, in a time when Poland's future was fragile and the university was concerned with preservation. While this tree is the best protected on campus grounds, it's one of dozens of a similar age all across Poland. Most of these trees are treasured by their local communities. In the occurrences when one dies, it's taken like the loss of a beloved community leader, and such trees are left to their dignity on the grounds that they've ruled for centuries. And this is due to superstitions far older than the trees. Throughout the last 1,000 years, time and time again, if the people cut down an elder oak tree, they would quickly fall to plague. Even the breaking off of branches would spell misfortune. Trees which were struck by lightning were seen as especially blessed, hand-chosen by the maker of lightning. Often lightning-carved injuries developed into large nooks or passageways which people utilized as sites for blessings and protective charms. In folklore, these served as magical hideaways for people who needed to vanish, in folk medicine as places to perform healing, and in some cases, such as in Wróblowice, the hollow trees were made into Christian chapels. These cavities became homes of all manners of spirits, so people left offerings of appeasement outside them, and this offering to the tree or spirits within it is superstition which has never fully gone away. The most recent occurrences we find in print are from 1900, but it's not hard to find an old person in a rural village which still leaves food for the trees. In the early phases of Christianization, the church would tear out and burn sacred oaks, but received such resistance and fear of retribution even from the Christian fathers that they very quickly turned to the adoption of such oaks as the sites of shrines to Christ and Mary. And likewise, the blessing of the tree was transferred into the new worldview. Shed and scattered sticks of an oak became vital to Corpus Christi and the full suite of spring and summer Christian holidays as symbols of protection and blessings over young Christ and his mother. And the oak became deeply sacred to Saint Jon, as oak leaves and sticks and acorns were all used in all manners of incense to chase out the devil, or in coffins or the lining of them in cases where it was feared this dead body would rise and attend to unfinished revenge. And especially on Saint Jon's day, the leaves and sticks of oak would be used in patching cracks in walls, and would be stuck around between fields to keep the demons far away, secluded in the dark forest. Indeed, the oak is king of the forest, and has always been addressed as such in songs and proverbs. The tree, strong like iron, using it also gave strength to people, sleeping in a bed frame of oak, making bread wrapped in oak leaves, cutting the hair of a child or their umbilical cord with implements of oak, all transferred the strength of the king of trees into the person. Even just leaning against a tree might cause it to absorb your illness or injury and fill you with strength, but the absorbed illness would linger in the tree for a time until the sun or wind would purify it again. So while this was commonly done with smaller oak trees, it was taboo to do with the elder trees, and it was right to ask the tree and watch for an omen before it was touched for any reason. And if the oak tree never gave an omen that it was willing to be touched, then it was never to be touched, because the king of the forest enjoyed his seclusion. The great might of oak trees led them to be associated with both eagles and falcons, the strongest of all birds and the kings of the sky. Of course, they might roost in any tree, but again and again in songs, the two become paired as natural complements to one another's strength. Of course, the kings of the sky roost in the king of the forest. In occasions where younger oaks fell, often from wind or sickness, or were cultivated from acorn to be dedicated for lumber, the people, especially of Lesser Poland, favored oaken beams for the foundations of houses, and whenever possible, to use as the massive grandmother or grandfather beams, which bisect the main room of a traditional home. And of course, the main beam itself also became decorated in wide varieties of magical symbols, but most often, and especially in the southern uplands, these were decorated with the Rozeta. This symbol also utilized on the exteriors of homes as the Thundermark, which chased away demons and kept evil out of the home, to then ensure that it wouldn't be struck by lightning. While oak and its materials were deeply protective, the people also took care not to plant an oak too close to the home. An oak prefers its space and distance, or else it might rain destruction rather than repel it. So most sacred oaks could and still can be found along the edges of farm fields, in the middle of clearings, in places where people exist but do not linger. All this reflected in the character of an oak in fables and folklore as the tired and wise old man who is unsociable or even reclusive, but who is deeply kind. We find that these countryside oaks kissed by lightning would serve as the concrete borders between several estates or chiefdoms, as the oak protected the border and probably served to bound the oaths made by various parties meeting at the boundary line, since, along with being the tree of strength and might, oak trees also stood for law and orderliness. So the trees at the outskirts of settlements found this function and survived their destruction before their widespread transformation into holy sites for Christians. Ongoing veneration of oak trees in the lifetime of historians allowed them to comment vividly and confidently. For example, Stanisław Sarnicki readily traced the lightning-kissed oak to the ancient lightning maker, insisting that they praised Perun as they stoked their oaken fires. The Italian Elias wrote during the Christianization of Lithuania in the early 1400s that such offerings were made to the lightning god Perperuna, which mirrored those of the Slavs. Alongside the attributes to oak trees themselves, many of these were given to young acorns, mostly to do with divining about future weather. Most famous is probably the custom of splitting an acorn to read its flesh, with the degree of the health of the flesh equating to the amount of rain and storms which the following year had in store. If in a pinch, if traveling without protective jewelry or clothing, one could rely on picking up and carrying an acorn for some fundamental protection from common demons or storms or basic misfortunes, along with the lightning stones which people associated with finding around oak trees. In folklore, a lightning stone is any natural stone which is shaped like an arrowhead or an axe head, but of course the term sometimes applied to the discovery of Neolithic tools left by hunter-gatherers, also sometimes to the natural fire-starting stones like flint, and to special fossilized stones which form when lightning strikes and instantly fossilizes wet soil. Many Slavs considered iron to generally be divine or to come from the sky or from fire, and the use of iron as nails or tools or even broadly as ore was frequently thought to give protection by repelling both invisible spirits and souls which wandered without their bodies. The carrying of any lightning stones was more or less the same protection as carrying oak. Warrior pendants. Of course, axes themselves are enduring symbols of protection and health. In the age of open polytheism, people of all ages and walks of life wore pendants in the shape of axes in two major forms, both as axe heads themselves and either necklaces or pins in the shape of full axes. These have both been found in graves as protective symbols, but were also worn throughout life. And since they're found alongside sites with near-identical full-sized real axes, it seems each pendant represented a real full-sized twin. The necklace represented it and served as a lucky symbol, which would protect the owner of the full-sized axe and ensure that they'd find their way home to the person who owned the miniature, and it would protect the person with the miniature with the blessing of the protection of the person with the full-sized axe. Both the full and miniature axe head would be covered with intricate decorative symbols, which also suggests their use in religious ceremony, much like the cloneclos, the ceremonial knife used by ancient Roman priests. For these reasons, even though the weapons used to sacrifice livestock in the polytheist era aren't often recorded in archaeological evidence, many writers connect the decorated axes to the sacred work of sacrificial execution, usually in the offering of livestock, but sometimes in times of war, the sacrifice of a human enemy soldier. This particularly especially attested in the far west. Axes used by Slavs were swift and agile, suitable for ambush combat on horseback or on foot, as tribal Slavs preferred swift surprise maneuvers. For their speed and versatility, very similar styles of axe and steppe hammer to those used by the Slavs in war were made by almost all steppe cultures over the last 5,000 years. While it certainly wasn't the only weapon used, appearing alongside varieties of swords and ranged weapons, the versatility of the smaller-headed shepherd's axe saw it used as the ceremonial or symbolic primary implement of the warrior hunters and the first elected kings who emerged from their ranks. This form of the axe barely changed in its evolution to the common shepherd's axe carried by the Western Slavs and Ukrainians, carried by all manners of travelers for their versatility in both protection and practical utility. While historical records on axe-based customs were sparse, the rituals alluded to in the Rus chronicles descend directly to the mace dancing and axe dancing in regions of Russia, such as around Novgorod, which survive to the modern day. Likewise, in the Carpathian regions of Poland and Slovakia, the folk axe takes significant focus in a rich variety of men's dances, which historians and folklorists consider to be descended from ancient rituals of steppe culture soldiers. Refreshing our memory from prior videos, as the Slavic tribes grew, they came to be ruled by democratic councils of community elders. These elders met in major cities to become elected representative councils, who in turn elected a king. The leaders on these councils were generally sourced from the social class of warrior hunters, who fought to protect their communities, and then kept their physical prowess by harnessing their skills into hunting. The custom of the axe dancers likely arose out of the fraternal practice fights between these warrior hunters. The dexterity and coordination needed to perform these dances would enhance and exemplify the harmony between the fighters in these warrior groups, enforcing their teamwork and brotherly bonds during peacetime. Since the fighters were also upholders of law and society, they would need a space to excel in their athletic skills which wasn't innately tied to violence. A tribal community is healthiest when the protectors are trustable and compassionate. Likewise, these feats of athleticism and strength might have also served as devotional offerings to the deity which granted them their skills, as a baker can burn a share of bread, or the hunter offers a portion of meat, or the miner leaves some treasure behind for the cave spirits. Since the axe was so associated with their social class, it made the obvious choice for such a ritual, similar to but distinct from the sword dances of the Don Cossacks or the people of the Caucasus. Some dances also intend to retell a local history or embody customs of a specific village. Some dances incorporate springtime and fertility rituals. Others mean to hope to bring good weather and appease the intensity of summer storms. Some of these dances were performed around the summer bonfire as part of the summertime renewal, which pairs the dances to the concept of axes made out of fire sent from the sky. The dancing axe only appears in men's dances, but we should highlight that both men and women carried these axes and necklaces in history, so the masculine element of the dance is derived from the dance itself, rather than the axe used within. Likewise, during many wedding customs, while the bride has her braids cut by her bridemaidens, the groom might sharpen his axe along with some dancing or celebrating with his men, and by the wedding, he or his men might come carrying axes. And in some villages, they might jokingly or performatively threaten to fight the men of his bride's family or the bride herself. Likewise, the bride's family might come lock the gate or come out with sticks or farming tools. This is all ceremonial remnants of a more ancient time when brides might be taken as prizes during war, and ties to symbolism of the death and rebirth and the figurative battle waged in the process of the wedding. We'll discuss this all more in the video about the goddess most tied to weddings, but for now we'll say that the groomsmen and the groom might often be associated with their decorated wedding axes. Likewise, in the springtime are the celebrations of the Day of the Thunder Awakening, often situated on February 2nd or 3rd. And on or in close proximity to this holiday is the awakening of the earth. So as candles are brought out that essentially allow the essence of the fire in the candles to cleanse and to return some energy into the sky above, allowing the lightning to break through the clouds and make its first return to eventually usher in the springtime. People take axes and they swing them into the soil as they'd swing them into lumber. And as the axe breaks into the soil, it helps break apart the frost in the ground and free the damp dew, allowing the soil to awaken and become its true watery form again. And in the seasonal sense, the axe and fire represent the fertility of the summer as it returns and rejuvenates motherland. And the axes penetrating the ground are representative of the Sky Father and Earth Mother. With some understanding of his sacred trees and tools, now let's turn attention to the god himself, as embodied within Christianized double faith. Saint Elias. Lightning was seen by the ancient Slavs as the form of fire within the sky, naturally both since it lit fires in many places it struck, and because this was the source of the stones which could renew their earthly fires. This is also why stones which set magical fires can be found in quite a few folktales. The innate connection between lightning and fire came to define Slavic conceptions of Elias. In standard Christian theology, Saint Elias is most known by his ascension to heaven aboard a fiery chariot. But while most Christians took this as a metaphor for the glory of heaven and ascension to it, the Slavs took it very literally, then tied this story into their pre-existing folklore. So Saint Elias rode across the sky in his chariot of fire, pulled by his horses who were also the four winds. Wherever Elias threw his spear, the fires of the sun would cascade through the heavens as lightning, the clouds billowed in the wake of his chariot, and demons fled from the saint's hunt. Even apart from the stones of lightning, many of us know Elias as the gifter of fire in the ancient times, ignited by the Father above, and then brought to earth by his chariot, so that we can light candles and fires in honor of the Father. Near the end of July or beginning of August, the Slavs hold a week in honor of Saint Elias, the lord and creator of every summer storm, so that he might allow them to pass through the summer without harm. After a week of fasting and festivities in celebration of the saint, the people would partake in symbolic axe and mace fighting, and hold a massive feast in honor of the saint. This holiday was broadly celebrated even into the early 1900s, reported in at least 2 places, but understood to be much further spread, in which the Russians sacrificed a sacred bull in honor of the saint, and then the men of the village took the meat to cook near a sacred lake. After the meat was taken to the village and a plate was made for the saint himself, all the other people feasted and sung songs. The festivities I know in Poland of the same time were much less extravagant, but the saint was also given his share of the holiday feast. Much like the drowning of Marzhanna or midsummer bonfires, the Feast of the Lightning Maker has survived to present day, and is still celebrated in an unbroken tradition, though many today are choosing to restore their images of the saint back into the form of the ancient Perun. While Elias ruled the lightning and storms in most of the Slavic world, some regions gave him companions or even credited another saint. In parts of the Slavic west and south, Saint Elias was accompanied by his sister Mary, who was the maker of summer rains to accompany his wind and thunder. In folk expression, we sometimes say she made the rains by milking the cloud cows, while many South Slavs famously framed an entire holiday around her summoning to appease the saint. In these holidays, they would dress a young girl as Perperuna, Perperuna, Dodola, Dola, all names for a similar character to that of the Rainy Mary from the west, and the sister of Saint Elias would be used to appease him and bring him back to return the rains. Or a young boy in turn might be dressed as Elias in hopes of bringing his sister back, either way to end the summer drought. Though we must highlight that this holiday is highly complicated as it's emerged from or been incorporated into a deeply complicated syncretic process across the entire Balkans. It's practiced not only by South and West Slavs, but also Romanians, Hungarians, Greeks, and Albanian folk songs of this custom have also been found to contain the names of distinct Albanian deities. All of this is to say that this was a pan-religious celebration from the region and is not necessarily intrinsic or indicative of Slavic polytheism. And the figure who is Saint Elias or his sister in the Slavic regions is not universal to all of the different subtypes of the holiday. Likewise, the girl, Dodola, Perperuna, Perperusha. Irregardless of her name, historians have tried to connect her and the contents of her folk songs to deduce a deeper understanding of who this deity may or may not have been in polytheism. And that exploration might wait for a future video. For now, enough has been said. Mostly among the East Slavs, the Saint of Storms was sometimes instead Saint Jurji, or Jurji, who is most famous for slaying a dragon, and it seems this association might have been made since those eastern tribes placed such incredible importance in the slaying of the primordial dragon in their cosmology. To much of the Slavic West, tales of Elias battling soldiers or demons of winter are widespread, a horde which includes dragons, but also a wide variety of other bestial and humanoid spirits. And to much of the West, the figure of Jurji won't often be used for Perun, since he's already strongly tied to another folkloric character who might be related to the King of Springtime mentioned in other videos. To Eastern Slavs, the fighting of a snake dragon holds greater weight as one of, or even the only main rivals of their saint. Therefore, Elias and Jurji become sort of conflated in a somewhat similar process to the conflation of different Polish huntresses in the development of Dziewona into the Huntress or Savior Maria Polonia, as we've discussed before. Poland's motif of the prince who triumphs over a dragon often symbolizes orderliness or fire, regaining balance with chaos and winter. But while these themes fell within the domain of the protector of the world above, they aren't specific to him. When we seek out myths about Perun or Elias, we must be cautious. Krekos doesn't represent Perun just because they both defeated a dragon. We need larger signifiers. Through all our searching, we've never found any fully intact tellings of myths about Perun beyond Perun as Elias in his daily travels across the sky with the clouds. We lack those tales as direct as the devil and god creating the world, or of Dziewona's destruction of the castle of Wisogura. However, we can identify a few stories which seem to descend from and evoke motifs of an older myth of Perun, in the sense that certain modern stories adapt ancient myths. These later stories seem inspired by an original myth, but their characters are not literally themselves Perun. We must be cautious with these added layers of adaptation. Kotygoroshko. One lineage of symbolism easier than most to detangle comes from Kotygoroshko, a folktale best known through Ukraine, Belarus, and Southeast Russia. Within the tale, a young girl is kidnapped by the mountain snake, a tyrannical king of snakes who lives in the mountains far away, and who likely stems from one of the regional forms of the snake lord who we discussed with Vovos. Then, when her 6 brothers try to fight the snake, all 6 of them are beaten and taken away to its lair. And as all hope seems lost, the mother happens to eat a pea from their field, and this pea magically causes her to become pregnant and give birth to a son who grows miraculously quickly, whom she names P. Let's note that peas are one of the summertime symbols of health and fertility. So the young boy soon develops incredible strength, and after hearing of his siblings' abduction, he vows to save them and he sets off to work. First, he digs a well with his hands deep underground and finds a massive piece of iron ore. Taking it, the boy sought out an old blacksmith who worked at the top of a hill and asked him to make him a weapon, and the blacksmith forged him an incredible mace, which he promptly threw into the sky, which caused the handle to crack off, which made it perfectly sized for the young boy. Then the boy found and defeated the snake, setting his siblings free. But on their way back home, they had to stop and camp, and as the boy slept, his 6 brothers tied him to an oak tree to return home themselves, claiming they defeated the snake and escaped on their own. But the mighty strength of the boy allowed him to uproot the ancient oak tree, and he threw it all the way back to his home, where it's sometimes said to have imprisoned his treacherous brothers. From here, we follow additional arcs, which we'll only allude to. The meeting of 3 mighty men, one who uproots trees, another who lifts mountains, and another who parts the waves with his hands, all who might remind Polish viewers of the giants who built the mountains, and of the many supposed children, such as a stone lifter and oak lifter, who themselves are well known. The boy also travels into a deep, dark cave to rescue a princess in a tale which likely descends from the pan-Slavic motif of the quest to the underworld, which we've also introduced before. Somewhere along his quest, after sheltering baby birds from lightning, the boy is ultimately rewarded by marrying a beautiful princess. From his weapon, specifically being one of the 3 usually attributed to Perun, to aid from an old blacksmith to forge iron collected by the boy himself, being strongly reminiscent of Svarog, the blacksmith god of fire, and the ties of fire to the lightning stones, along with the oak tree and associations with possible mountain builder giants, who we very briefly touched on, to saving baby birds from a thunderstorm. Every chapter of the story ties to symbols of Perun in a deeply interesting way. While it can't be fairly said to be a myth about Perun, the tale very likely descends more directly from ancient myths than most others do. We might glimpse a myth of Perun now lost, wielding his lightning to defeat the Lord of Snakes and free his siblings to establish a world of balance. The miraculous birth of the lightning god to save his siblings would evoke parallels across Eurasia, from Zeus's conquering of the titan Kronos, who swallowed his siblings alive by wielding the thunderbolt made by the Cyclopses, to Indra, who frees all the rivers who were trapped in a mountain by the great serpent, the great personification or embodiment of drought, who is crushed by Indra under the mountain with his mace. To the Dacian, forgive me for this, Zibothiardos, and to the Thracian Svelsvirdus, who were sky gods who also defeated primordial or magic snakes. These religions are not the same, but the existence of these common tropes help affirm the archaic origin to the Christianization era folk motif. Another similar catalog of interconnecting songs and tales comes from Slovenia, where stories are told of a magical human duke or prince named Kresnik, typically the son of God in folklore, with golden hands and golden hair, associated with a golden ram or a golden deer, which he takes the form of when he lives in his home, and with his horse brother Trot, and the golden chariot which he rides across the sky, sometimes along with the personification of the sun as a lady. Kresnik was born on the faraway magical Golden Mountain, also called the Ninth Kingdom, and he was often the 9th son of his mother, carried in her womb for 9 years, baptized 9 times. Living with his horse brother atop Golden Mountain, Kresnik would defeat the mountain giant Vuvel who invaded his home. Then he defeated the giant monarch of snakes, Awakens, a creation of Vuvul who is seeking to capture Kresnik's herd of cattle and terrorize the lands below Golden Mountain. Then in return, young Kresnik followed the snake into the palace beneath the mountains, where he meets the queen of all snakes, who he defeats in a card game, and he wins her golden crown, then escaping atop his loyal horses who fly through the air with the winds. Going down into the kingdom of humans, a final snake follows to terrorize the people. A snake was crossing the river Drava. It was so large that it stemmed the river's flow as it was creeping across. Folks say that the Drava flooded the entire field and ran among hills planted with vines. One can still see the dry, winding riverbed it left behind. The snake crawled towards a mighty castle where its enormous body, its tail and its mouth, coiled around it, and the castle was imprisoned. Imprisoned a beautiful princess by the name of Vegina, and for 6 months Vegina had kept imprisoned in the castle by the snake. Then, on St. Jurji's day, the handsome Count Kresnik came along. He positioned himself over the snake, but since it had wings it lifted into the air. But Kresnik, who was a sorcerer, grew wings, and a fierce battle took place in the air. Kresnik defeated the snake, threw it into the deep castle well, and chained it to a rock with a strong chain. It has been lying there to this day. After the fight, golden wheat started to fall from the sky, and Kresnik took Vegina for his wife, and they lived happily ever after. Several authors have asserted that Kresnik as a figure is identical to Perun, but when we examine the context of its kindred tales in the West and East, this seems to be a similar situation where the ancient myth of Perun's fight against the primordial dragon became the inspiration for a mortal demigod with descendant but updated themes. All this to say, I don't think that the Polish Krakos or the Eastern Mace Child or Kresnik are literally Perun, and the few modern Slovenian polytheists that I've encountered prefer to take the myths very literally. They view Kresnik as the son of Perun, and a human woman who was destined by fate to live out a life similar to his father's, true to the thematic motif of the son's life echoing the father's, which makes it so difficult to differentiate Perun from his own father Svarog. They hold that, with the death of Kresnik at the end of the myths, the demigod was made into a god of the summer solstice, a time sacred to both his father and grandfather, a generational chain of fire gods. The ties between Kresnik and a golden deer again speak to the shared symbolism between Father Perun and the heroic child, as the probable children of Perun named the Golden Stag and the Huntress Volna are both discussed together here and share similar symbolism. Likewise, the name Kresnik also becomes a title bestowed upon mortal magic makers or polytheist priests. Especially in regions of Croatia, the Kresniks are white or benevolent Wiedźmini or witchers, who take the form of white wolves or deer or falcons in their sleep as they battle the black witchers who shapeshift into animals to cause harm by night. This is a symbolic chain of protective heroes of light and fire which spans from the first Father Svarog to Perun to Kresnik to his witcher Kresniks, a symbolism of inheritance and teaching of leadership and duty and honor which is passed between the generations. To gain further understanding of Perun, we'll now redirect our discussion from his legacy in dual faith and folklore back to what we know of his worship by the polytheist tribes. Once we've covered the most important ancient sources, we'll return to add everything together and discuss the total nature of Perun. Oaken Steward. Within the Chronicles of Hemald discussing the Germanic conquests of Pomerania, the author described ancient beginnings to the customs of sacred oaks. Around modern-day Starogard, he described his visitation of a major polytheist temple for its destruction. On our journey, we came into a forest, which is the only one in that country, for it all stretches out in a plain. Among very old trees we saw the sacred oaks which had been consecrated to the god of that land, Prove. There was a courtyard about them, and a fence very carefully constructed of wood and having 2 gates. For beside the household gods and the idols with which the village was adorned, that place was the sanctuary of the whole land, for which a priest and feasts and a variety of sacrificial rites had been appointed. On the second weekday, the people of the land went to assemble there for holding court with the ruler and priest. Entrance to this courtyard was forbidden to all except to the priest and to those wishing to make sacrifices, or to those in danger of death, because they were never denied asylum. For the Slavs show such reverence for their holy things that they do not allow the sanctuaries of divinities to be defiled by blood, even in times of war. They admit oaths with greatest reluctance, for among the Slavs to swear is, as it were, to forswear oneself, because of the avenging wrath of the gods. The Slavs have many forms of idol worship, for they do not all agree on the same superstitions. Some display in the temples fantastically formed images, such as an idol at Perun, the name of which is Bogyt. Other deities live in the woods and groves, like Królowi. Of these, no effigies are fashioned. The meaning of this god's name, królowi or Perun, directly relate to pravo, which more or less translates to legal laws and regulations, but with the strong connotation of honesty and legal honor, while also extending into society's rights and duties. Pravo is law not only in the legal sense, but in the social contract. Obviously, this god was patron to the warrior chieftains and elected kings who were given full access to his shrine, the guardian of the domains they upheld in their society, and as these rulers had emerged from the older system of warrior hunters, their patron of law is almost unanimously understood by scholars as synonymous in function with the tribal god Pierun. Just like as in Egypt with their ancient god Sobek, he began as a regional patron of fertility in a single river valley, before eventually growing to be one of the primary dynastic gods celebrated across Egypt, his domain greatly expanding with his ascension into the formalized class of rulers. In much the same way, Królowi was the Perun who became specified around the norms of rulership to the Kyivian tribes. Many Polabian and Pomeranian tribes embodied the nature of their code of law with the eternal fire, that their law predated and superseded any of its mortal keepers, an ancient fire bestowed by the god of law. In the temple spaces, these fires would never go out, at the cost of the guardians' lives, which made the keeping of the law identical to the protecting of the same sacred and undying flame, which also embodied the life force of summer and its survival through the winter. The keeping of the eternal fire as an embodiment of undying law, especially in the cult of soldiers, has endured through all of Polish culture into the modern day. The flame of the law of soldiers is now housed in the tomb of the unknown soldier in Warsaw. Similar sacred groves have been identified via archaeology across Poland and eastern Germany, and of course many more oaks survived simply without obvious polytheist decoration. One especially fascinating oak tree was discovered in 1909 within the banks of the Diosna River. This oak was decorated with 4 boar's tusks carved into the wood as it lived, so the tree had healed around them. And a few decades later, another sacred oak with 9 embedded boar tusks was also discovered within the same region. And lower in Ukraine, along the Dnipro, on the large island of Kortystia, the touring Constantine witnessed the Slavs praying and offering to the sacred oak tree of the island. Here the Slavs sacrificed live roosters to the tree and offered it bread and good cuts of meat, sticking arrows in circles and performing for the god who ruled the grove. In a few places we found images which historians connect to Perun. None of them are certain since the Slavs lacked written language and many were discovered hidden beneath churches or in secret places where they were spared from the destruction of the pagan idols. So proper temple context, which might be found with cultures like Greeks, mostly won't help us in our identifications. Guardian idols. Most idols which have been identified with Pierun might be sorted into 4 categories. The Volgast church icons are alike to one another, depicting a heroic figure wearing a long, armored uniform. One of them wields a spear, while another wields a mace. Both look up to either the sun or the highest star Polaris, as they strike a heroic and athletic pose. They somewhat resemble icons found with a man holding a drinking horn. But apart from the stance and art style, there's no clear indication that the warrior and the horn drinker directly connect. So while they might depict Pierun, we should note that they also resemble a great Moravian icon which very likely depicts the forging of the sun by the blacksmith god Sverog. That warrior has also been tied strongly to a series of idols which constitute our second category. The warrior is in the same type of armored outfit with his hands on his hips, a pointed decorated helmet, and a striking beard or mustache. Given the vague and generalized appearance of these warriors, historians doubt that they're intended to represent any specific human leaders. At the least, this is an archetypical conceptualization of a warrior, but he likely represents a warrior god. One of these was found near Novgorod, where one of the largest temples to Perun was described by the chronicles, increasing the likelihood that it and the statues like it are depictions of Perun. Somewhere between these categories comes a third, consisting of relief figures striking dynamic poses, such as these well-known images of a warrior riding on horseback, and a figure in armor or heavy coats who lifts either a hammer or some type of box or bag. Considering the prevalence of horses and riders to Perun in folklore, including sources we still need to explore, I'm sympathetic to this hypothesis, but less receptive to the hammer or box holder, who could also easily be the blacksmith god Sverog. Next are the series of busts which represent the head of a warrior with a helmet or cap and a mustache or beard. These could depict specific humans thanks to their detail, or might represent the conceptual warrior or a god of warriors. More could be known if full idols survived, or whether they were full statues like those in Rugen, or were household or small idols, or were those tree-shaped idols like those found and described from Kyiv. I find it likely that they depict warrior deities, but without their temple contexts, I'm not sure we can insist they must be Perun. Lastly, we know wide varieties of full-body statues who hold drinking horns or weapons, or sit atop stick-figure horses. While these are sometimes asserted to be Perun, we absolutely lack the details to claim who most of these deities might be. It's simply too vague. Turning to historically attested and described sites, in the city of Kyiv, while it was the capital of the king or High Duke Vladimir, he constructed a major temple to several deities populating his diverse realm. Among them was Perun, given silver hair and a golden mustache, to whom the soldiers and princes prayed and made oaths. Here, Kyiv recognized Perun as king and leader of the greater pantheon. Alongside him was his wife Mokosh and other high deities, while his rival Wowos was left out of the hilltop shrine and venerated down near the marketplace and lower river. At this idol of Perun, whose body might have been made of oak wood, people would also burn fires of oak in offering to Perun, in a similar custom to the sacred oak fires also burned in Mazovian Poland and Lithuania and Prussia. Though we must emphasize that King Vladimir's attempt at a Slavic pantheon in Kyiv was innately reformist, and so his depictions of deities are not innate representatives of organic rural faith, but instead of his concentrated attempt at making a unified pantheon closer to those of the Greeks or Romans. Far to the west, in the region of southern Moravia near the border between Austria and Czechia, the stronghold of Pohansko used to stand, and northeast of the Great Moravian Church was once the temple of a polytheistic pantheon. The entire temple was circular with a series of wooden pillars in a C shape behind it, protecting the idols inside the perimeter. Of them, there were 9, with 8 orbiting smaller idols around the center largest 9th idol. Since these idols weren't recovered, their artistry can't be studied, so we can only speculate about the deities which stood within. But this image of a central deity surrounded by a ring of smaller idols is incredibly unique to this site, and suggests this village followed a pantheon with a single chieftain god who held a highest status, and it might be speculated that this also was Perun, elevated in status as he was in Kyiv or Pomerania. But I caution that we don't know this for sure, and other possibilities will become clear in a later section. In the western extent of Ukraine, archaeologists identify possibly the largest of all known Slavic temple complexes, rivaling the famous temples of the island Rugen. Here atop the mountain named Bogyt, roughly meaning the place of God, there stood a large temple, which was surrounded by supporting villages and additional sacred places, such as the hill forts of Glovda and Svenihorod, and the peripheral mountain Sabarika with its own temple complex. The bulk of these settlements and shrines were built from the 8th to 11th centuries during the last phase of the pagan Rus and the start of their Christianization, suggesting this mountain remained as the holdout for paganism after the baptism of Kyiv and the destruction of the royal temples. But fascinatingly, the Slavic temples in this area are built atop the foundations of far older sacred sites, first constructed by the Scythians, or Scythians, almost 1,000 years before. Here lies a Scythian kurgan rising beside the Slavic village, and the most ancient dolmen stone within the complex was constructed around the year 3000 to 3500 BCE. This mountain has hosted religious temples for as long as people have populated Eastern Europe. From among the Slavic constructions, the primary cultic circle is comprised of a raised platform, which is surrounded by 8 bowl-shaped pits, which were filled with animal bones, pottery shards, Slavic jewelry, and all manners of valuables. Within the central 9th mound was a stone-lined pit, which once housed a statue of the deity of the temple, also made of stone, which sat tightly into the pedestal. This statue would have had a very similar dimension to the famous Zbruk idol, which had been previously discovered in the lowlands nearby and taken to Krakow University for studying, leading many to conclude that the idol might have come from this temple, though we don't know this with certainty. The smaller surrounding temples, like that atop nearby Mount Sabaria, were made in a similar but smaller configuration, making the identification of their deities incredibly difficult to tell by the complexities themselves. If the cult of Kyiv was reflected across the Rus domain, then the largest complex was almost certainly in honor of Perun, as the chieftain of the Rus princes. But given the immense antiquity of the complexes, the Slavic settlements beginning just 200 years prior, it's also very likely that the temple to Perun was just the newest primary temple in a long line of major shrines which continually evolved with all the religions which called this mountain their home. Therefore, this largest of temples can paradoxically teach us little about Perun or his worship. Despite its immense historical importance, we just don't know how much of the design was inspired by the temples which existed before, so we ought to keep looking to keep learning about Perun. Faces of lightning or polymorphism. To gain deeper understanding, we need to explore some deeper theological concepts. In What Do Slavic Polytheists Believe?, we touched on pluralistic polymorphs. Pluralism only indicates several things coexisting, even if they seem contradictory or redundant. Polymorphism is a metaphor from chemistry, which is most easily shown by geology. Everything is made of atoms, and several atoms of the same type come together to form an element. An arrangement of pure carbon atoms will form different appearances depending on its environment. Pure carbon can become brilliant diamonds, or crumbling graphite, or graphene. This is also true for compounds of elements, so calcium and carbon come together to form either calcite or aragonite, depending on environment. The polymorphs, or multiple forms, are the products of arranging the same type of atom into different chemical patterns. The same fundamental thing becomes changed by its circumstances. In theology, we can apply elements to larger deities, and then polymorph forms as variants or so-called lesser gods who comprise the larger god. This example is imperfect, but we can compare to Hinduism's avatars. The god Krishna took the form of several avatars to live several lives on Earth. The primordial fish, then the sea turtle on the back of whom the gods and demons lived, then the great boar and earth raiser, then the destroying dwarf, and then the slayer of corrupt kings, then Rama, the hero of India's great epic, the Ramayana. Each version of Krishna still also persists beyond their life on Earth. There is Krishna, and there are many who are comprised of Krishna, and who together comprise Krishna. Also quite similar are Kemetic Egyptians, who often observed the son of a god to also be their father, seen often with Horus and Ra, two gods who have many forms which also might be their children. While the mechanisms aren't identical, Slavs also are pluralistic and polymorphic. Most scholars have agreed that many of the names which appear only once or twice in history in relation to specific areas are likely related to larger and wider spread deities. Some have speculated the Slavs had a wide central pantheon, much like Rome, but also had local taboos preventing the proper names of powerful deities to be spoken aloud, causing several titles to develop across the Slavic world. While this is plausible, it also raises an issue of why Slavs made regional taboo names for every region. Perun, when often in other religions like Hellenism, we see most of the Hellenic world share a common title for a god, and if they develop taboo names, those also become widespread across the Hellenic world. It doesn't make the most sense for Slavs to use different taboo titles when they traveled between different tribes on their routine pilgrimages. If Ridagost was a taboo title for Svarog, then it's strange that Slavs came from all over to visit Svarog under the name of Ridagost, but then when they returned home they called him Svarog again. It still seems these many names were related to a few larger deities, but instead of simple taboo, each temple or region instead evoked specific faces or forms of the larger and wider spread deity. Infamously, among the Borobians, few scholars can agree on the identity of the three-faced god Triglav, since he was only ever identified using that title. It's understood that it indicated either that one specific god was mainly associated with three faces, or that this deity was evoked particularly for only three of his faces. Either way, it indicates that large regions of Slavs agreed on how many faces certain gods had, and that some would be evoked while others were not. And which faces were evoked could make a meaningful difference that affected how idols were built. Figures treated as siblings in folklore could effectively work as faces of a larger deity, as we find with the twin god idol and with manuscript depictions like these, probably drawings of the goddesses of the dawns, but one shows them as two sisters and the other shows them as a three-faced deity. Some might be thinking of the aforementioned god Prove, who could go either way between an alternate name or a distinct face or form. It might be that Prove's form took exceptionally high focus to the domain of law and government as a distinct manifestation of Perun, specialized for their changing society. They might have prayed specifically to this one domain or face of Perun in the maintenance of their system, while only praying to the older god of warriors in actual situations of warfare, separating him into the faces of law and the faces of war. Or maybe they overall just followed an idea of Perun which was simply more about law and less about the warriors as an aspect of their local culture. It's hard to say, but serves as a good introduction to this whole conundrum. Certain authors have taken absolutist positions that only a small few Slavic gods existed and that most or all of the less frequently named gods were simply forms of Perun. Others have taken an opposite absolute position, that the Slavs knew hundreds of distinct gods without any shared pantheon at all, more like the extreme differences found between different groups of Celts. Here, I'll try to explore a broad and open-ended middle ground. I think it's likely that a good number of attested gods were forms of either Perun or another major god, but the matter is often ambiguous, and I feel it best to leave the judgment to individuals and what feels right to your personal practices. With all that said, let's begin exploring probably the biggest headache of a topic in all of Slavic polytheism. Grom, Face of Thunder. Maybe the simplest introduction to forms of Perun comes through the mid-1500s Polish historian Maciej Stryjkowski, who wrote about 300 years after widespread paganism ceased and about 150 years after rural paganism became rare, but also with access to a number of earlier church writings which are now lost. We have a lot of material to cover, so if you want our full thoughts on him as a source, then check the footnotes in the citations document, but for now, we'll stay focused. Among the gods of the Mazovians, one of the tribes of modern-day central Poland, he identified a pantheon consisting of a solar god Yasa, also deathly Nia, harvester goddess Marjona, beautiful Zilzila, wild Javonna, Lel and Polel and their mother Leda, windy Zivi, the clear sky god Pogoda, the windy god Polvist. In a further section, the author explains the Mazovians also knew the gods who Ruthenians knew, namely Pierun, Storib, Mokosh, and Kors. Interestingly, though this chronicle implies that it describes every god of the Mazovians, separately in his poetry the same author also wrote, Christ, you enlightened Mieszko, who was born blind, and you brought Poland to your baptism. Grom, Ladon, Morana, Pogvizd, and Zevona gave up to you. We might assume Ladon is the father of Lel and Polel and the husband of Leda, as Jan Długosz had written. But who is Grom? In the Polish language, Grom is primarily a word for thunder, another form of żmot. though it rarely also means lightning in a very similar sense to English with the thunderbolt, because language is weird. The few historians who mention this attestation to Grom usually assume him to fully be identical with Perun, which might imply the mutual exclusion of one or the other was just an outcome of the author considering them as synonyms. But I find it strange for him to point out Perun as specifically one of the gods shared with the Ruthenians, along with the windy gods Thrib. So if his pantheon list already includes 3 wind-related deities, then couldn't they just be said to be Stribul? If Grom was removed for being identical to Perun, then why weren't any of these 3 wind deities removed as Stribul? It's perplexing. So let's look at the other 4 and then circle back around. Pochvist or Bogvist is highly self-explanatory, meaning whistling in the sense of the howling whistles of the winds. After polytheism, the name was transferred to a very well-known type of folk spirit and a poetic personification of the wind, which are both easily found in folk songs. It's sort of intrinsic to Polish and other Slavic languages that wind is often personified in the same sense that lightning is also often personified. Here is a Christian poet who mentions a folk demon in his bad company as he praises God and laments that he's likely destined for hell. Likewise, in another, the largest wind is described as God's breath, but the lesser winds are brotherly spirits who are evoked to embody the wildness and enormity of the Cossack steppe. The so-called god of clear skies is given the name Pogoda, mentioned in the account of Prove as a different deity who had a large and extravagant temple. And this is deeply interesting since Pogoda basically translates to weather, both good, bad, and everything in between. Since the deity is distinguished as the god of clear skies, alongside 2 gods of wind, it comes off as an attempt to differentiate them from the other 2. The identities of these gods seem to interest the author, but we must remember he's writing for an audience of holy men. Every author of this type had to balance any genuine interest they had with the expectations of the other holy men. So if clear skies are associated only with this god and not the other 2, then it might be simpler to describe it as such, even if this isn't the full picture. Likewise, Pogoda and Doda or Dodola might share a linguistic root. Likewise, the inclusion of Jurji as a windy deity is deeply interesting, since the closest other name, Jvia or Jiva, attributed by Hemald and Jan Dugosht with a major patron goddess in Polobia, whose domain is not described, but since her name is etymologically basically just a proclamation which roughly translates to, she is alive, she is full of life. Most historians take her to be a goddess of life or fertility, but if her name means life while her domain is identified with wind as it is here, that might allude to more a goddess of fertility giving wind and rain, the folkloric conception of the summer storm. That also reminds me a lot of the Balkan rain-causing goddess, but this admittedly is getting highly speculative, so we'll leave it alone for now. Strib is clearly Stribul, and his name means wind and windy god, but there's no indication of what makes him distinct from the whistling god. But given the folkloric belief in a father of winds who raises 4 directional winds, who then give rise to many smaller wind spirits, which we'll discuss next chapter, it's reasonable to wonder whether the 4 gods pertaining to wind, Pogvist, Pogoda, Jivvi, and Strib, might also relate in some way to the 4 winds of the 4 directions, and the seasonal connotations which come with those directional winds. In folklore, the north wind is most inhospitable as it whistles and roars in the Arctic air, and the west wind is poetically connected to clear sunsets and the burning away of clouds in the evening after long mornings of fog and rain. The south wind with the rains brought down from the mountains. Then the east wind is also a thing but not well defined. But the Rus were to the east of the Mazovians, so it might be the case that they associated them with the Rus. This is getting more speculative than I prefer, so I'll wrap this up. But I think that we're approaching understanding what might be the difference between Grom and Perun. If 4 different winds are listed because 4 different winds are believed in, 3 identified as local and 1 identified as shared with or from the east, this might have implications for Grom and Perun. In his intimate poetry of the Mazovian experience, the name Grom is evoked, and in the formal list of deities, the name Perun Perun. This seems to reflect a belief in Grom as having a distinct and wholly Mazovian identity which matters to their history, so when speaking to Mazovians he uses Grom, while as he simplifies the narrative for other holy men, he evokes the Ruthenian Perun. It displays a belief that Grom is distinct from Perun, but also similar enough that people who don't care about the details would probably list them as just one god. It sounds a lot like a local face or form of Perun, and I imagine the distinguishing characteristics likely revolve around cultural associations with thunder rather than lightning. While lightning is like an arrow or axe, a quick, decisive strike, thunder is more brash and etymologically relates to words for smashing, or a massive chaotic situation with similar connotations to, in English, riot. Grom associated first to cannon fire and the imprecise but awesome might of rows of artillery strikes, and later to the firing of guns as symbolic embodiments of elemental thunder. Basically, a shooter or gun-wielding soldier is literally a thunderer. This all gives an impression that Grom could reside further into the domains of conflict, both war itself and the force of the military classes justice and law, distinguishing him both from the more wise and tactical connotations of the quick striker Perun and the more judicially coded sense of law and honor within Prove and his serene oaken grove. And he might have worded it this way because of a recognition that in the east the Perun is not separated into the Thunderer and the Lightning Maker, while in Mazovia he was. So to the east the differentiation is lost, while in his local poetry the distinction is still important to him to make. Of course, I'm not saying that everyone has to agree with this, but you might begin to see why so many people so often argue about this whole type of thing. Father of Winds. Beyond obscure chronicles, the figure of the Father of Winds can be found throughout Polish folklore. He mainly appears in the tales of Polish folk heroes in the position of a divine advisor or aid to an honorable youth. His appearance most familiar to me is in the folktale about the whirlwind who steals the princess. To make this fairly long story short, a mischievous, dark magic dwarf takes the form of a whirlwind or tornado and steals away Princess Ładna from the kingdom near the far end of the world, and an honorable knight Dobrotek is sent by the king to save her, under threat of death and the effective genocide of all of his people of his county if he disobeys. On his quest, a human skull tells him how to summon the white and golden horse, who appears to him out of a bolt of lightning, his nostrils shooting fire, sparks flying from his eyes, storm clouds trailing from his mouth, and when the golden horse gallops, he runs atop the storm winds as a lightning bolt, and the miracle horse gives the knight a suit of golden armor and joins him on his quest. They meet one of the ancient giants, who turns out to be the brother of the dwarf, who was betrayed and decapitated by his brother, his head becoming a mountain and the giant suffering for years. The story of the injustice of brother betraying brother rallies the heart of the knight, and he flies on the golden horse to the lair of the dwarf. When the golden horse gallops, he runs atop the storm winds as a lightning bolt. In the end, he defeats the dwarf and wins the hand of the princess and inheritance of the kingdom to become a more virtuous ruler. This or a very similar horse appear in other tales in smaller roles, or sometimes one of the four winds is explicitly identified as a horse, with the implication that the father of the winds is the first horse or the king of horses, and that all horses are innately fiery and atmospheric animals. In a variant appearance, the Lord of the Winds might take the form of a wise man who travels on a cart with a collection of pots, and inside these are the malevolent winds, while the horse who carries him is the true and trusted wind, and issues arise when a thief or foolish youth or demon steal the jars and let the storms within them be released. These restrained winds evoke symbolism from another creation story in which God, the god who created lightning and gave fire to humans, tasks a human man to transport a sealed jar from the mountains to the lowlands so the jar can be cast into the ocean to effectively be deleted from the world. But as the human man was transporting the jar across the lands, he couldn't help help his curiosity, and he looked in and discarded the cap. Then, in only a moment, hundreds of insects and reptiles and all the lowly dark creatures of the world spewed from the jar and dove into the lowlands and quickly hid and began to multiply. And hearing the commotion, God discovered the incident, and he changed the foolish human into the first crane, and he tasks the crane to spend the rest of his days hunting for the insects and reptiles he freed, so he and all of his children are still cursed to hunt them today. These all complement a folk idea seen in the 1700s and 1800s poetry, where God is like a fisherman or a trapper, a complementary metaphor to Elias hunting the wintertime demons, but the collecting of demons rather than chasing them away plays into themes of justice and the maintenance of order and law, rather than hunting symbolism which more strongly evoked war. Readers easily imagine the demons being collected into jars or boxes where they're held captive through the summer, only to break out again at the onset of winter. I could go on, but I think it's been demonstrated that the polytheist dual-faith poles, at the least, didn't conceptually separate the domain of winds from the storms which so often spawned them, lesser winds appearing as the children or possessions or relatives of an elder wind who is the lightning. But there's also nuance. It seems Kresnik and his horse brother Trot, and the old man of winds also having a windy horse, speaks to some distinction and otherness between the embodiment of lightning and the wind father. They are both one, but they're also not identically the same. This strongly evokes the impact of two different faces or forms of the polymorphic Perun, the lightning and the winds. As we also identified the thundering Grom and the Oaken Steward as other potential faces. The wizened father. To understand the totality of Perun, we should finally discuss his second most prevalent holiday appearance. So we once again discuss an aspect of Koleda, the polytheistic winter solstice and its remains in dual-faith customs. In the winter parades are both the black or dark spirits led by the devil and Lady Death, while the white or bright spirits are led by the child with the paper star ornament, who probably first represented the sun itself, but later became syncretized with the Star of Bethlehem. Then the two starry personifications, the Little Lady Star or Winter Bride, or God's Little Child in Sorbia, as mentioned before, is connected either with the fiery Jevonna, who also appears a couple months later as the Lady of Thunder candle, and is understood to be the daughter of Pierun, or she can otherwise be a variant of Saint Lucy, who is the younger form of the mother goddess Mokosh, who we'll discuss soon, and who is understood to be the mother of Jevonna. The Lady Star is associated with the first star, the custom of going to the field and looking until a star appears which can be wished on, though we must stress that this is a spiritual or symbolic role, as the specific star might be different between different places and times. The first star is not the name of a star, it can be one of several stars. She travels with Gviezdor, the old man star, who is the brightest star in the sky. Star Sirius is sometimes also nicknamed the Watching Eye of God or Christ or Saint Elias. The old man giving gifts and startling naughty children into behaving by shaking around his horsewhip or his walking stick, who sometimes rides atop his hobby horse, is understood to be the aging and weakening counterpart to the heroic rider of summertime in folklore. As the sun grows further away and the magic of her power and their father Svarog the smith is pulled away out of the world, the summer god Perun loses his strength and remains a little longer to give his last gifts to the people he watches over and inspires into moral and righteous behavior. And then he must depart to his home on Crystal Mountain in the world above, where he must regain his strength, leaving Earth and the terrestrial undying fire in the watchful care of his daughter Jevonna. With an elderly late-year Perun in mind, contrasting with the youthful Perun of spring and the firm warrior chieftain of summer, we're enabled to find other mirrors of the elder Perun in folklore. While the realm of watery magic and the Viejmasirs are easily paired to Volos, the other end of the magical spectrum is fire, and the magic of fire is often very aligned to the domains of Perun. The Zurets or Zurzis were the priests who tended to the eternal fire and cared for the temples of the Polabian and Pomeranian tribes. These elders were responsible for making sacrifices of life to the gods, and were most often associated with the keeping of the sacred space, for they would protect the threshold of altars strictly. In several temples, such as the Temple of Sviatovit and the likely of Rudagost, the priest was the only person ever allowed in the space of the deity, while the Pomeranians allowed the public to visit temples, but they were otherwise closed to only the priests. Again, this class of priest was tasked with forbidding bloodshed or violence or any wrongdoing which would disrupt the sacred nature of his assigned holy space. The Zrits devoted their lives to caring for the god whom they pledged to. But these priests also read the stars and kept track of astrological dates, and took part in reading the weather and seasons. They also took lead in matching and marrying young people in the community in times before church weddings. The Zirzish have been identified as one half of the two-winged government in the Polabian tribe of the Rani on the island Urugan. These people had an elected king who was appointed by the Council of Elders, but also a ruling priest who was appointed by some religious ceremony and with communication to the gods. So historians have generally understood that the far western Polobians, in their conflicts with outsiders, had increased the power of the king and of the temple priest in harmony to maintain balance between human and divine judgment, leading in the case of the Rani to an incredibly powerful priestly force who stubbornly and violently resisted conversion. These leaders of the religious community, keepers of the sacred space, readers of the sky, and caretakers of eternal fire, are understood to be the magicians or witchers in the domain of Perun, and the fire of law and summer. We will also note that the Jersha were only known for rising to this high priesthood in the western and northernmost Polobian tribes, while the rest of the Slavic world embraced the rule of the mortal king without balancing him against a high priest, instead folding the customs of the fire protecting and temple keeping under the authority of the king. The Slavic East knew the separate higher position of the Volkiv, Volkov, or Volk, but these were more associated with earth magic in the domains of Volos and Mokosh, so they won't be investigated here today. The legacy of the fiery priests is the fiery witcher of folklore. In countless folktales, an old man might be mentioned as a protector of a certain specific ancient place, and this man can often take a role similar to the lightning horse or to the Western spiritual guide, to the hero, like King Arthur's wizard Merlin, an old man who reads a prophecy from the fire or weather and teaches valuable knowledge and wisdom to an honorable and well-hearted youth who he deems deserving of his aid. The wisdom of this old man, or sometimes woman, is sometimes associated with owls as house spirits. Either he gifts a youth a protective animal companion who guards their home, or villagers in general ask him to help summon a house spirit, as an owl or starling or swallow or falcon, and they live in the barn or attic. And while we're here,
Perunovi. Restanța uponiżowania.
the connection between Perun and the Fire Witchers is well known. Elders' magic. Images of these wise old men are incomplete without exploring the context of ancient Slavic cultural conceptions around wisdom and its relationship to magic and aging. In the broadest terms, the Slavs believed that competence and skill in all forms of magic would improve over the course of life as a person gained experience. The knowledge gained by living a long life was generally a cornerstone to ancient Slavic society and the rule of community elders. In much of Slavic folk magic, even enduring today, we see magic as an extension of the soul or life force, which is essentially stored in the body, particularly in the hair and the body's core or torso. Hair functions like the memory of your magical soul. All the good and bad luck you experience is stored in your hair. And so, if you grow out your hair, you retain a stockpile of both white and black luck, which can both be tapped into for your magic, but also the saving of all this memory like magic could easily drown an inexperienced witcher in the weight of their past, overwhelming them with more good and bad than they can bear. So it's generally recommended that magic novices either cut their hair short or bind it in veils to insulate it away. While we're here, if you intend to harness the magic of your hair but don't want to risk growing it out, you can carry it in a small pouch and use it in spells. Similarly, burying your hair around your home, especially if you're going into some great danger like war, can help your soul find its way back home, either in life or death, while often serving as a lucky charm to increase your chances of returning home alive. As people generally grew older, but especially as they became more adept in magic, they began to grow out their hair, but also bind it. In much of the Carpathian region for several centuries, but only lasting in a few places today, 1 to a few tidy, long braids of hair were favored by men and women alike for allowing hair to grow long, but remain harnessed and under their control. Along with a few ponytail-like hairdos, in much of Poland and Ukraine, the men were fond of shaving most of their head, while leaving a long, wide strip of hair to a similar outcome as a braid. And this wide and common family of hairstyles had an extreme end form in the Polish Kotun. Essentially, when their hair eventually naturally tangled, they took it to be tangled by a spirit, so they would leave this tangle and help encourage more hair to tangle around it, over time cultivating it into a series of natural braids which were highly potent in their magical concentration, somewhat like how trees can concentrate their souls into fruit, until the hair grew into a single massive and multi-layered self-made braid. But the epitome of the self-realized and expert elder witcher was the long and untied head of unruly hair, the classic image of the Slavic priest. Historically, only the priests and a small number of elders ever grew their hair so long and freely. Elected kings were also likely to grow their hair to embody their wisdom and competency in rulership. The legacy of this affected the classic appearance of the Polish king for long into Christian rulership. Similar applies to Polish facial hair, which is a large reason why beards were fairly rare in Poland, but mustaches fairly common for so long. These customs all have much to do with air and fire magic, which again highly involve cultivating innate magic from within your souls, one made of fire and the other made from air, while watery and earthen magic are more oriented around exterior magic sources. Since Perun had brought fire to humanity, and since lightning is made of fire, the deeper nature of fire holds significant focus to the nature of Perun. For now we'll return focus to the Old Man of Wisdom and his other elemental tie to the domain of the air. Lord of Clouds. From the Father of Winds and his 4 children rise an additional variety of smaller spirits who inhabit their domain. One of these is also one of our most prevalent so-called white demons or benevolent tricksters. The words humornik or poenetnik, both linguistically from cloud or storm cloud, had described, especially in the eras of partition, a type of witcher who was gifted with the magic to foresee and predict the weather, and often controls it. In some villages, they made spells and charms which won the favor of the clouds, while also making spells which could heal the people of the village or ward away general malevolencies, like Jort or Vampire. In other villages, the Poenetnik armed himself with magic and flew into the sky to battle the storm dragons and demons who lived within storm clouds, which he vanquished with flashes of fire and sent back to their watery homes. Sometimes the Poenetnik was the creator and lord of the rainbow, which was seen in these villages as a divine fire which he conjured to climb like a ladder into the sky and enter the clouds, to rid them of demons and dragons. In Christianization, this Poenetnik was also the fate of people who died suddenly, often in suicide or war, who became a spirit who lives in the sky and shepherds the clouds. He is often seen as an old man with a broad hat, who prods and leads the clouds with his walking stick. This old spirit, the cloud shepherd, was fickle and frustratable, but he could be appeased by townspeople, by offering wheat grain into the winds or by burning wheat or bread under the open sky for it to use its substance and soul. Very similar to Peunie is the white demon Perun, a tiny bird or little humanoid spirit who is made of fire, flying as a falcon or flaming wind and potentially becoming befriended through folk charms, and then living inside a pocket or jar. This tiny demon made of fire could be conjured by incubating a rooster's egg under a human caretaker for 9 days. This tiny fire is an obvious cognate to the wild sky fires, also seen as birds, who would be called St. Elmo's fires and swamp gas fires in modern English, those strange atmospheric plasmas which glow like mysterious fiery birds. This benevolent fiery bird was also the opposite to a malevolent or chaotic Latovitsa, which was also raised from a rooster's egg and was used as a servant by witchers to collect golden grains. This fiery demon, a bit like the atmospheric dragon of rain and water who we discussed previously, were very well known for seducing and laying with humans, as an embodiment of the sexual and the consuming nature of the elemental fire, and for this reason their name became slang for promiscuous humans, similar to English words like whore. The Latovitsa looked like a big black bird, either a sparrow or owl, whose wings whipped up whirlwinds. But these demons feared thunderstorms, and were killed by lightning along with kindred black or malevolent ground-dwelling demons like Jurji. Though not unusually for Slavic folklore, certain villages, especially in Mazovia and East Pomerania, see the Latovitsa as a two-natured spirit who can become befriended and then invited inside as a household protector spirit, who takes the form of a sparrow or owl and roosts in the attic or loft space of the home, her fiery essence contributing to the health of the stove, as she feeds on demons who try to sneak inside the house. This flying demoness is very similar to a winged variety of the demoness Striga, often appearing like an owl woman or starling woman who is widely feared for her deep appetite for drinking human blood and causing bad luck. She is wise, powerful, magical, but so very terrible, and she's kept away with iron nails, and iron weapons, and if she is found sleeping, she is chained in iron, and a flint is put into her mouth, and she is burned. This won't be the end of her, she will live, but this will keep her away and encourage her to leave and search for easier prey. She can be slowed down by leaving tiny pieces of metal all around, as she'll need to count and sort them all one by one to get them out of her way. To keep her from feeding on corpses and graves, iron weapons, such as sickles and axes, would also be left around the body, especially near the neck. But she was feared not only for her predation on humans, but that her appearance was an omen for misfortune, and her owl-like screech was the mark of oncoming tragedy. A good sacred bird, a neutral and complicated sacred bird, and a terrible sacred bird all share similar qualities of their fiery and atmospheric domain. All of them reflect little pieces of Perun, much like the goddesses who reflect Jelvonna. While none of these are understood to be Perun, they are all sacred beings within his domain. Their conflicting outward behavior but consistent internal substance reflect the nuances and complexities of the world. Everything in nature can be good and bad. The givers of fortune can take it away. Roaring God. Returning to the island of Rugen, the city of Hanza hosted the eternal fire and high priesthood opposite the city of Arkona, which hosted the king's seat. The temple of Hanza consisted of 3 segments housing 3 gods, 2 5-headed deities named Porivit and Porenat in opposite sides, and between them the temple of Rayevit or Rugevit, whose name is fairly straightforward, but we'll describe his temple first. His idol was made of an oak tree. He was almost twice the height of a man. He had 7 faces all around a single head, with 7 full-sized swords hanging from his belt and an 8th grasped in his hand, and on his chest was a nest of swallows, which were allowed to remain as a sacred bird to the god. But otherwise, the sacred space, which was separated from the world by purple curtains all hanging around from columns, it was only seldomly and carefully entered by the priesthood, all of this described by the historian Saxo Grammaticus. Rayevit's name is most easily understood through the most obvious significant other word which shares its origin. Kashubian ruin, Czech ruin, Old Slovak ruin, Croatian ruin, Old Church Slavonic ruinu, Old Bulgarian ruin, Old Russian ruin. The archaic root of ruya, or ruti, is most readily seen in the names of months within the autumn. North Americans and Europeans likely already know that this season contains the mating season of the deer, also called the rutting season. At this time, the hormones of deer drive the males to fight in performative displays intended to impress mates and intimidate rivals, and all through the morning and evening, the stag deer can be heard roaring or bellowing. And so due to their bellowing at this time, Ruya became Ruyan, the name of the breeding season and the fervor of the breeding. Saxo further tells of the capture of Hanza by the Danish crown, and he describes the superstitions which prevented the Slavs from removing their god, so he recounts. For that reason, they were asked to take the statue out of the city, but they refused for a long time, because they feared that they were going to lose mobility in the limbs which they used to comply with the order, as the god would demand punishment for it. And it is not surprising that they were afraid of the power of those gods, remembering that they had punished their sexual transgressions many times. For, in effect, in this city the men would lay with the women, joined in sexual congress in the manner of dogs, and they could not separate themselves no matter how hard they tried. Sometimes both fastened to posts on opposite sides, would exhibit before the people the ridiculous spectacle of their strange union. Obviously, there's heavy Christian overtones in this story, but if we strip the most obvious away, the people of Rugen believed that their god Rayevit held power over their bodies. Saxo stated when describing his idol that he was called their god of war, so it is heavily implied, though not outright stated, that he likely took power during a battle, that he took control of limbs and in this way gave strength to fighters. And likewise, Rayevit had the power to seize a person and make them rut as a deer ruts, because as a deer ruts they cannot do anything other than rut. All their time and all of their behavior is consumed by the rut for about a month. Likewise, Rayevit is described as seizing control of two people and keeping them in control for a long period of time, so much so that they could not be kept. They could not overcome this animalistic power. It's not clear from the text on its own whether the people of Hanza believed being seized by Rayevit was a curse or bad thing in and of itself. In Slavic culture, we often see the taking on of a role to embody it as a sacred act, dressing as grandfathers to invite the grandfathers in the holidays for the dead, the dressing of winter demons to encourage the real winter demons to run away with them. There's precedent for the belief that inhabiting a spirit and being inhabited by a spirit is a spectrum phenomena that can be positive, negative, or all kinds of neutral. So I might suppose that the sexual connotations of Rayevit probably had a positive side. There were probably circumstances where people would pray to have that happen as a blessing, and that this tale was recounted to the Christians specifically to convey in terms the Christians would understand the phenomena of being possessed by Rayevit. The Christians were very open about their feelings about sexual promiscuity, so if the Slavs were trying to describe in vain what it was like, that would be the natural, obvious example. Regardless, between these domains of sex and war, the nature of Rayevit is pretty self-evident. Rayevit is a fiery god in the most potent, dangerous, and extreme connotations of fire and fire magic. If we think of grobie or quick-striking Perun as the gentle and grazing pohanetnik of the nature of the god, then here on the other side, Rayevit is the dangerous and mysterious counterforce. He is the danger in harmony with the blessing. He is the ability of fire to burn and harm in opposition to fire as warming and nurturing. And Rayevit was very likely praised portrayed to on the island of Rügen because the people of Rügen were embroiled in a 200-year war against the Danes, and in this extreme circumstance, they needed a god of extreme war. But we also want to stress not to paint Rayevit in a two-dimensional sense. Even lost in the fray of the rut, no deer is a simple creature. Generally, a rutting deer will still protect their herd. They will still fight off and scare away predators. They will still uphold their duties to their community. Deer are highly social animals just as people are, and whether the deer is rutting and in the fray of conflict and breeding, or if it's the opposite end of the year, and the deer are separated again in small groups of male and female just living their best life. These are not two different beings. The deer that ruts, that kicks, that thrashes is always within the calm deer, and the calm deer always leaves a remnant within the rutting deer. Likewise, we don't want to lose track of Rayevit's core. He is a god of war, destruction, and sex. An explicit god of sex like this is also fairly, to be clear, taboo for the norms of the Slavs. In paganism, relegated to certain festivals, magical rites, closed cults, and parents, not something that would just happen in the open as with the possessed people. Despite all that is ghastly and garish about Rayevit, we should highlight that he stands beside the statues of his sons, that he is still made of an oak tree, that he still watches the sacred fire. He harnesses this immense power and aggression in interest of maintaining law and protecting family, as is true for every nature in every version of Perun. Two Thunderers. To the far north of the Rus domain, the island of Perun was home to another temple to Perun. Nowadays, the rivers have been restricted, so the island has grown into a small hill, but 1,000 years ago the island was private and secluded. Within the Rus primary chronicle of 1110, and in two of the Novgorod chronicles of the 1400s, the Rus recounted the destruction of the Novgorodian temple. In the year 4688, Vladimir appointed his uncle Dobrina to rule in Novgorod, and Dobrina came over in Novgorod, set up an idol of Perun above the Volkhov, and the Novgorodians offer Perun sacrifices, as to a deity. In the year 6497, Vladimir was baptized and appointed a metropolitan in Kyiv and an archbishop in Novgorod, and destroyed the altars, chopped down the idol of Perun, and ordered it to be dragged to the Volov, tying it with ropes, dragging on dirt, beating with sticks, and ordered everyone not to accept it anywhere. During the process, Perun was possessed by a demon who started to scream,
"Oh woe, oh me, I am in malicious hands."
And he was thrown into the Volhiv. He swam over the great bridge, throwing a mace down on the bridge and saying,
"Let the Novgorodian children remember me with that."
Now crazy people fight themselves with maces, entertaining demons, and everyone was ordered not to accept him. Perun hit the shore, and he pushed away the idol with a stick, saying, "You say, Perun, you had enough to eat and drink, so go away now." And the vicious floated away. In summary, the idol of Perun was raised by Vladimir's men and was later cast downriver. Then that statue supposedly came to life and threw a mace onto the bridge, and this is supposed to be the start of the mace fighting and dancing celebrations which the city maintained. Much like a Polobian tale we recounted with Rayevit, this seems to be a polytheist myth which was repurposed into the narrative of the Rus's Christianization, while also serving as a recognition of polytheist customs and beliefs into the Christian era, which were recontextualized instead of just being destroyed. Even in official church chronicles of Christianization, the writers, even with contempt for paganism, are also reluctant to fully erase it, probably out of conflicted respect for their forefathers. And this type of compromise is what allows dual faith to survive into folklore. Unless they mean throwing his mace down onto the... Was the bridge struck by lightning while the Christians were throwing the statue into the river?
Ja pierdolę, wioska strzelił Pierun. No?
Wyłącz ten telefon. Kurwa, wyłącz.
We know enough to recognize that Perun was not the original patron deity of Novgorod, but was brought in by the centralizing pantheon and government of King Vladimir. The establishment of the temples of Perun in Kyiv and Novgorod were attempts to centralize Rus leadership and religion, which was known at the time and recorded by travelers to the Rus and by the chronicles, as the god Kors was known to be somehow related to an Iranic god, and Mokosh somehow to the Finnic-Ugric people in the domain. This has led researchers to arrive to one of two general theories. The first hardline theory holds that Kors was wholly imported from Iranic culture, Mokosh wholly imported from the Komi or Karelians, and they conclude that Perun was literally just the Nordic god Thor, who was brought by the Nordic kings and nobility in the first centuries of the Rus. These researchers believe that Stribog was supposedly the original Slavic weather god, and that Svarog was the original leader of the pantheon, and that they were replaced by Thor when the Nords arrived. The other soft line theory, first argued for by Alexander Bruckner, is that the gods of Kyiv were fully syncretic, which means rather than comparing it to the temples in Athens or the temples in Giza or the city of Rome, we should think of it as closer to the syncretic Greco-Egyptian religion from overlapping hotspots of cultural exchange, like Alexandria. So, just as the syncretic Greco-Egyptians came to view Hermes and Thoth as exactly the same god, so they combined attributes of both into a distinct new religious tradition, likewise the Kievan Mokosh was the mother goddess of the Slavs, but also the mother goddess of the Komi or Karelians, so she was sort of wholly unique in this form within this temple. Likewise, these authors hold that Perun of Kyiv was the Slavic god of lightning, but also that he was syncretized with Thor and probably other lightning gods too. This just means that the Kievan Perun would be similar but also slightly different to the older Rus version of Perun. I also want to highlight that while many people have theorized that Perun might just be Thor, at least in Kyiv, a lot of these people don't actually articulate what they believe to be the characteristics or behavior or attributes of Thor. They just kinda take it for granted. So in working on this, I am obviously not a heathen, so I asked the heathens that I do know to give me what they believe, and I also read one of the sagas. And after reading as much of Thor as I could, and after hearing from the heathens, I've walked away with the impression that they have a pretty consistent idea of Thor, that most heathens would describe Thor as a very capable man who can absolutely kick ass, but that he is not exactly a soldier. Whether he's Thor or Thunor or Dunor, everyone I talked to described Thor as a compassionate and warm god of the common people, that he is like a friendly uncle and is most associated to them with drinking and celebrating, that they will turn to him to protect them in the idea that your uncle will show up to beat up the punks who've been messing with you, that he has very prevalent comical themes in the sagas, disguises himself as a woman and is found out because of his mighty appetite for food and drink, that he is a rotund, jolly, big god, that Thor is not actually who most heathens would identify as a god of law, of rulers, of leadership, of war, that the type of honorable soldier that we would associate with Perun is closer to the heathen god Tyr, that Tyr's chaining of the wolf Fenrir, in which he lost his hand, is the most comparable thing in Norse myth to the idea of Perun fighting the snake. The impression I got from every heathen that I talked to is that Perun is not like Thor, that Thor is not like Perun. Another heathen suggested that Perun might be more similar to Odin than to Thor. And I'm not saying that it's wrong to syncretize Thor and Perun in your personal praxis. I'm just saying that the idea that they were historically identical seems to rely on assumptions about Thor that I can never possibly find a single heathen back up. I might go so far as to assert that maybe the Kievan god was syncretic between Thor and Perun, but if he was, then this god of law, of orderliness, of justice, of the upper class, the cult of leadership, of the elected representatives who became the king, that this Perun of Kyiv, if syncretized with Thor, is still closer to Perun than he is to Thor. So between the two theories discussed, the second flexible syncretic theory makes more sense to me, but it also seems to neglect the full implications of polymorphism. If the gods were known to have many faces, but the statues in Kyiv had one face each, it's reasonable to ask whether several of the statues might represent several forms or faces as they were interpreted. Again, a single figure might be interpreted as siblings or companions, like the rider Kresnik and his horse brother Trut. That all to say that Perun, as he was depicted, might have specifically been the quick striker lightning god, while the god of the winds might have been separately rendered as Striabog, two gods in the opinion of the more simplified and standardized Kievan pantheon, but potentially two faces of the larger deity in the opinion of the Masurians or Polabians or the Grand Temple atop Mount Bogyt. God's sons. If this video has felt too straightforward, you'll be glad to hear we're entering the deeper theological chapter of discussion. As we've alluded to, the Slavs saw their gods within their domains. Most obviously, the lightning bolt was named Perun itself, and each bolt of lightning might be seen like a finger of the god. Every piece of his natural domain is a part of him. The presence of the lone man, or a man and his chariot, or two characters of the rider and the stallion are so interchangeable because regardless of which version you tell, they are all Perun. The rider and the stallion are just two components of Perun. Also, the clouds and the winds are Perun. Every cloud is like a tuft of Perun's hair, and this is where the pluralism comes into pluralistic polymorphism. There is the father of winds, and the four winds who are his children, then the large number of lesser wind spirits, as well as many minor demons of the atmospheric and fiery domain. There are Slavs who identify the line between Perun and not Perun at all different levels, including the far-end conception that since Perun's body is all wind, his children and grandchildren of the atmosphere are all also greater extensions of him. They would say an individual wind demon is also their father, the north wind, who is also their father, Perun, so that the minor wind demon is also one part of Perun, but not the whole of Perun. Others will not agree, but might see the commonalities between parent and child as an inherited quality. Now this all gets more complicated when we consider the interconnecting natures of divine domains. Most important here is the element of fire. Slavs generally believe that everything is made of the elements fire, water, air, and earth. In the time of creation, there was the god who was made of fire and the god made of water, the fiery father and the watery mother, who combined parts of themselves to create all things. And next, the fire gives shape to the god in the boat or the white bird, and the water gave shape to the watery devil or the black bird, and their rivalry gave rise to the earth, which is the middle world, the air and the world above, and the afterlife in or under the primordial sea. Generally, many Slavs agree that the father made of fire, the father who is within every fire, is the god we call Svarog, and his son, who eventually resides as the guardian of the world above, is Perun. Some Slavs think that the creation story where God fights the devil is about Svarog and Vovos, and others think it's Perun and Vovos. Personally, since Vovos rises from the water goddess, I think it makes sense for Perun to arise from his fiery father right away, and many Polish polytheists I've met generally seem to share this view, but many also think that the battle was with Svarog, and that Perun was made after the earth was created. Either way, the large theory remains. Likewise, a few Slavic organizations or denominations hold that Svarog himself had another father, named Rod, or sometimes Bog, the distant god who is within everything and who all things are made of. His existence or lack thereof won't substantially change our discussion. Since Svarog is fire, that means Svarog exists not only in the fire on your candle, but also the fire in the sun, and the fire in your soul. There's a small bit of the father god within you, as is the mother goddess in the water in your flesh. This makes judging the line between Svarog and Perun a bit complicated, because lightning is literally made of fire. Lightning is a form of fire, which sounds a lot like we're describing a polymorphic face of fire, which which could make Perun a face of Svarog. Yet, while lightning is made of fire, the winds are made of air, and the nature of thunder might even suggest it has a presence of earth or water, implying that Perun contains not only the fire, but the wind, maybe the earth and the water. So my understanding is that Perun is made of a much more direct and significant amount of Svarog's fire than any mortal or lesser spirit. But he also contains a small amount of the watery nature of his mother, the airy or windy nature created by mixing fire and water, meaning the element of air really traces back to Perun and begins with Perun and not with Svarog. And this makes the soul and identity of Perun distinct from Svarog, that Perun needs the air to be Perun, while Svarog does not. So with this understanding, Svarog being Perun is only true in the same fundamental sense that all of us are made of little parts of Svarog, not to say that Perun is a face of Svarog. But this understanding is absolutely not universal, and I think it's fully possible to logically argue in favor that Svarog and Perun could be one and the same, which some polytheists do. Just as some polytheists will argue that Kresnik and a large number of heroes in folklore must be identical to Perun, even though I consider them to only be his children or grandchildren. I'm not trying to instruct anyone on how they should interpret the passing of elemental fire from father to son, or where the lines between deities lay. I'm just trying my best to introduce the topic for you to eventually answer these questions on your own. And as the nature of fire and many of its traits pass from Svarog to Perun, they pass to Perun's sons, and a similar question exists with many of what we've discussed might be faces of Perun. Not only is this argued with Kresnik, this is argued with Rayevit, this is argued with Prov, this is argued with Grom, and there is no simple concrete answer that definitively says whether they are child or face. That will require your own exploration into theology, and that is beyond the scope of Slavic Polytheism 101. Crystal Mountain. Let's return our attention to the place where Kresnik was born. Crystal Mountain is a recurring mythological setting which is highly implied to be the place in the Sky Realm, or representative of it, the place where the celestial gods reside. Though in some tales, Crystal Mountain also seems like it's used as the bit of the mortal world that is immediately most adjacent to the divine place. Again, folklore will inevitably highly vary. Every day the sun is escorted on the fiery chariot off of Crystal Mountain and around the world, and by the end of the day the sun returns to Crystal Mountain. And so we say the sun lives on Crystal Mountain during the night when she cannot be seen. Crystal Mountain is the place where many saints with atmospheric or light connotations like Elias live. It's the place where the stars live or come from. And most importantly, we could say that all the sky is Perun's house, and that Crystal Mountain is the stove, the heart of the house. On Crystal Mountain is burned the original eternal fire. It is the embodiment of Perun's domain as a place, and it's very appropriate that it's a place where much of the family of Perun lives, because at the core of Perun, of his law, of his order, of his war, of his hunting, all of this extends from societal importance of protection. All of this is derived from the warrior hunters, who were the people who protected their tribe. They were the adoptive or symbolic parents of the entire community. The root of Perun is the burning passion, the love and affection for all in his home, for his family. Here, the sun, the dawns, his siblings, his children all live in his protection. And as some folklore says, like that of northern Pomerania or of parts of Warmia and Masuria, in the beginning, all animals came from the stars. There was the earth, and there were plants and life on the earth, but there were no animals until the stars sent down a fire from the sky. And from the fire from the sky was made all the animals, including people. In Lesser Poland, the god of the sky also made people. He took heaps of earth and mounded them together, and using fire and lightning he baked them into the mountain giants, and from the mountain giants arose the people. Or they say he made us through the same method that he made the giants, by sculpting us out of clay, breathing the breath of life into us, and striking us with the light from the sky. There's a story from Russia, recorded in a chronicle, that in the beginning God and the devil decided to make humanity. So the devil made humanity out of the mud of the earth, and God breathed the fire of life into us. The core of the conception of Perun is the protection of family and the upholding of order in the family. And from Perun, all of us are ultimately descended. And so, to a degree, Perun hopes to be a father and protector to all who accept his law and the rule of his house. So to centralize and organize everything we've learned, there is a god with a large and complicated domain budding into many faces which connect to a consistent core. Usually, Slavic Polytheism refers to the whole deity as Perun, though very strictly speaking, Perun seems to have been the name of the quick-striking or lightning face of this deity. The quick striker is a figment and embodiment of the warrior hunters who were beloved and respected by their tribal communities as their protectors, a god of speed, decisiveness, and overcoming conflict. This god is also Prove, a god of law and the maintenance of society. They are a Rugavit, a god of giving yourself to the possession of the passions of the fire of your heart, to the entirety and animalistic enormity of love and of hate. They are symbolically and by extension are the father of many archetypical heroes, a youth of virtue who is smiled upon by the god who gave the virtues and morals which they uphold, a symbiotic strengthening between the god of nobility and the noble person. They have connections to nurturing through their possible sister of rains. But, as we'll discuss in future videos, many historians also extend to this aspect a warfaring and ferocious counterpart, while also the god who represents a chain of fatherhood and the inheritance of virtues from father to son, the repeating of the fate through the family, and the father who very likely made humanity and the law to protect them, the fire which warms them in the first place. The formal god of law, leadership, and upper-class priests in the Kievan Rus. The folkish god of wisdom and elders who roams the countryside, who stands fast, holding on to this world even as his life force is fading until the very end, so that he can keep protecting and keep gifting. A generous god and a stern, lawful god. A vicious war god and a compassionate family god. This all is Perun. There's so much to the domain of Perun that I struggled to condense it down to a video that is a understandable and watchable human length, but I hope that I succeeded in doing that. Thank you very much for your patience. I wanted to do this video the best that I could, so I ended up doing a few redrafts until it felt right. Gods, this video probably won't be up until All Souls Day. Well, All Souls Day is about honoring noble ancestors, and it uses the purifying fire which he gifted us, so I guess it works. Yeah, we'll say it works. Have a blessed All Souls Day and All Saints Day, everyone. Thanks for watching, and please leave any questions in the comments. And I hope to return with more Slavic Polytheism info dumping a bit sooner next time.
Do siewca z nami bić, po się zbrogować, będą się ukości.